The New York Rangers might be open for business when it comes to trading K'Andre Miller. We discuss why this might actually be a good idea for the Blue Shirts.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1322 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, Jon Chik. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, and we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So this is the big K'Andre Miller show. As you guys know, the everydayers are very well aware. Every offseason we do this. We take a look at every single impending UFA and RFA on the New York Rangers. We give them all a fair trial. We talk about what the future might hold for all these players, whether they're going to stick with the Rangers in the short term, the long term, be traded, be allowed to let walk if in the case of them being an unrestricted free agent. And today, going to spend some time on K'Andre Miller, one of the most important and probably the most intriguing RFA or UFA of any kind for the New York Rangers this offseason, because there's a strong case that can be made both ways to extending him or dealing him before next season begins. And the thing that maybe really want to talk about Miller today, we were going to get to him eventually one way or another, either way, but there were some interesting comments made by Elliotte Friedman on his 32 Thoughts podcast about K'Andre Miller. It was posted a little bit earlier today, Wednesday, as I'm recording this. This episode will likely drop on Thursday. We'll get to Friedman's comments in a minute, but to begin with, I just want to throw out the idea that I don't think anybody should really be all that surprised by the idea that the Rangers are potentially looking to trade K'Andre Miller, at the very least, seeing what's out there and trying to gauge what the interest level is and what they might be able to acquire in exchange for K'Andre Miller, for several reasons as far as why this should not be surprising. First of all, Miller has not yet gotten an extension. And that's not to say that it can't still happen, that it won't still happen. It obviously still could. But this is a season where, despite all the turmoil and the drama and everything that happened behind the scenes and the low effort games by the Rangers and the, questionable moves by the front office and everything that went on there, this is still a season where we saw the Rangers give out contract extensions like it was Halloween candy, basically. There were no fewer than 5 players on the Rangers that got an in-season contract extension as the year progressed. You had Igor Shesterkin, obviously the big money deal. Alexis Lafreniere, slightly smaller, but still big money deal in comparison to Igor Shesterkin. Jonathan Quick re-upped with another 1-year extension. Will Borgen got 4 years, and even Eero Vakanainen got 2 years. Now, obviously, there are a lot of factors at play here as far as why these guys got extensions and K'Andre Miller did not. For starters, different roles on the team, right? And these are different players at different stages of their careers. They play different positions and everything. Igor's your franchise goalie. You want to get him locked up. Lafreniere, obviously the former number 1 overall pick. You wanted to get him locked up. And then unfortunately, his game really kind of, declined for the rest of the season after that extension was signed. And in the case of guys like, Quick and Vakanainen, they're short-term deals at a small amount of money. K'Andre Miller's going to command more money than either of the two of them. So there's different reasons as well. But still, facts are facts. The Rangers re-signed 5 players during this past season. K'Andre Miller was not one of them. So that right there tells you that, the Rangers aren't rushing this idea of locking up K'Andre Miller long-term. On top of that, his play at best has plateaued the last 2 seasons here, and at worst has slipped, particularly this past season. This past season, we saw Miller make a good amount of mistakes, mental mistakes, some mistakes in big spots in the game when you have to have, laser beam focused. And just the fact that he did this in a season where he knows at the end of the year he's going to need a new contract, that's concerning, because we don't want a similar situation with Lafreniere where they sign the new contract and then they take the foot off their gas. And I'm hoping Lafreniere can bounce back. I'm hoping K'Andre Miller, if he is back with the Rangers next season, I hope he can bounce back as well. But you don't really like the optics there when somebody who needs a new contract, even with that being the case, for some reason or another, really seemed to struggle this past season. Just didn't seem to have that fire, that intensity, that physical edge to his game that we've seen from Miller in previous seasons. And one more reason why I think that it shouldn't be that surprising that Miller, his name is at least out there, is that the contract demands from Miller and his camp are said to be high. We saw that report earlier this season where Miller and his camp looking for a significant raise on his current contract. And right now, Keandre Miller is finishing up a 2-year contract that paid him a grand total of, let's see, what was it here? It was $3.82 million per season, $3.87 million per season. So he's looking for a significant raise on that. How significant is significant? I don't really know, but I would say at the very least, his camp is probably looking for about $5 million per season. And I'm just not sure if that's worth it right now for the Rangers for a couple of different reasons. We'll get into them a little bit more, a little bit later in the episode. But as far as the comments from Elliotte Friedman himself, and this kind of got a lot of Ranger fans talking on social media, and obviously made me want to do a Miller-centric episode here today. Friedman was asked about the possibility of Keandre Miller needing a change of scenery, and Friedman mentioned that on this podcast, they had talked about Bo Byram, about a week ago or whatever it was, and listeners of Friedman's podcast asked Friedman if he could kind of, expand that discussion to include other defensemen that might be looking for a change of scenery, or not necessarily looking for one, but could benefit from a change of scenery. And this is what he had to say when the subject of Keandre Miller was brought up. One of them that people said to me was Keandre Miller, that it's not a guarantee, but they are testing the market on Miller. They want to know what it is. We'll see where it goes, but his name is definitely out there. And he did go on to mention that Miller is a great skater, but also that this was a very challenging season for Keandre Miller and also the Rangers as a whole. Whatever we say about Miller or this Ranger or that Ranger, I also want to make it clear on here that, look, the Rangers did this to themselves, and it's not the fault of any one or two players. This is a collective result of a lot of players underperforming, and in some cases, no showing and or just playing bad hockey. It doesn't fall on any one or two players, that is for sure. But as far as these comments are concerned, I 100% believe this, that the Rangers absolutely are open for business, that they certainly would listen if another team comes calling about Keandre Miller, that they might even be proactive. They might go out and talk to other teams about, hey, what do you think about Keandre Miller? What would you be willing to give us for them? I think for sure it makes a lot of sense for them to test the waters, because I know Miller, there's differing opinions, right? But at no point recently has Miller looked like a player, established himself as a player that should be untouchable. And I think even the biggest Keandre Miller fans out there, because he does have his fans, and certainly there are people that would like to see the Rangers hang on to Keandre Miller, re-sign him at the very least to a short deal. There might be some people that want Keandre Miller locked up to a long-term deal, and you can make a case for that. I mean, he is still just 25 years old, and he has played well in the past. This season was clearly not his best, and there are people that don't want to see him traded. But I asked this to that group, as far as Keandre Miller is concerned. Very fair question here, I think. Even if you're the biggest Keandre Miller fan in the world, do you really think at this point that he's untouchable, or that he should be untouchable? Because I certainly do not. And the funny thing about that is, as recently as I would say 2 seasons ago, I would have said, yes, he's, not untouchable, but man, you got to give up. Like, if anybody wants Keandre Miller, you got to come in here with a king's ransom. You got to really make it worth our while. We need, a proven NHL player in return, maybe a draft pick as well, depending on who that player is and what round the draft pick might be. But Miller, for me, he's still on his ELC at the time, and it's looking like, okay, the Rangers got this right. They've had some swings and misses as some players that they've drafted in the first round, but Keandre Miller is not going to be one of them. I thought at the time he had already established a very safe floor for himself and also a considerably high ceiling. He's going out there and competing against some of the best players in the NHL and going toe-to-toe with them, playing a physical brand of hockey as well. There was a time, and again, as recently as 2 years ago, where I truly believe Keandre Miller was a pillar of Ranger hockey going forward. And you can lock in Miller and Adam Fox for 10 to 12 years on this Ranger blue line, and I would have completely signed up for that. Now, I just don't know what's happened the last couple of seasons. It's just bizarre to see such a sharp decline in his game. And at this point, whether you're pro-Miller, anti-Miller, whether you want him here, whether you don't want him here, I don't think there's too many people that want to hear any talk about his upside or his potential. Because, yeah, you know what? Keandre Miller is still just 25. He'll be 26 in January. So, it's possible he's still coming along, but he's been here for 5 years. It's half a decade. It's 368 regular season games plus another 43 playoff games. And yes, some players, they're up and down from one year to the next. Maybe that's possible with Keandre Miller. Some players, excuse me, they might not fully reach their top of their potential until maybe a little bit later than their fifth year, maybe like their seventh year or something like that. That's all possible and that's all well and good. But for the most part, I mean, you can't call this a small sample size. We've seen a lot of what Keandre Miller is capable of, and we've seen his faults as well. They've all been right there on display for us the last 5 seasons. He's always on the ice, and that's a credit to him. But we've gotten a massive sample size of Keandre Miller. And I don't think there's any like hidden secrets or hidden levels at this point in his career. Maybe inconsistency, like I mentioned, year-to-year inconsistency. Some players do struggle with that. Maybe he's one of them. Maybe he bounces back in a major way next season. It's at least possible. But I don't know. I mean, I was concerned with what I saw last season. And I know I'm not the only Ranger fan that would say just that. But in just a second, we're going to take a look at if the Rangers were to hang on to Keandre Miller. What would that new contract look like? What would be fair for both sides? And should the Rangers consider ponying up the dough when it comes to hanging on to Keandre Miller? Like I said, even though I'm certainly open to the idea of trading Keandre Miller, I do want to give him a fair trial, as we do all impending New York Ranger free agents. And in just a second, we'll talk about what that contract might look like, what it might cost the Rangers to keep Keandre Miller in just a minute. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there has never been a better time to get in on the action than right now. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways to play than ever before, and they have ways to play smart and win big. Obviously, we're getting down to the nitty gritty when we're talking about the NBA playoffs and the Stanley Cup playoffs. As of this recording, just 4 teams left standing in every sport, and there's no better way to get in on the action than checking out some of those same game parlays on FanDuel. Do yourself a favor and go check that out. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you will get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. A big shout out to the everydayers. As always, thank you guys so much for sticking with this podcast even through the offseason. I mean, I guess it's still the postseason right now. It's just unfortunate that the Rangers obviously are not a part of it. But in our next episode, it's actually already recorded. We're going to be taking a look at 3 different NHL prospects in this year's draft class that the Rangers could potentially target with the number 12 overall pick, provided, of course, that the Rangers keep this year's pick and do not give it to Pittsburgh. They owe them a pick either this year or next year. We'll see how they look to go about that. But as far as the 3 players that we're talking about in the next episode, I put a big emphasis on size and just overall energy, guys that just bring it every single night. We're going to be talking about 3 players that fit that mold in the next episode. Definitely looking forward to that. But for right now, let's go ahead and keep the focus on Keandre Miller, and specifically what it would cost to keep Keandre Miller. And we'll get to the financials in just a second. But for starters, something that I got to throw out there that I think would be a ripple effect of Keandre Miller getting a new contract is I think it would mean that Chris Kreider is traded. Now, I know there's going to be some Ranger fans that are happy about that will make the joke that a lot of us have thrown out there, whether they're talking about Kreider or anybody else, that, I'll drive him to the airport myself. I get it. But the idea of Kreider not being here next season doesn't necessarily make me happy because he has been here for so long. To me, I just see it as kind of a necessary evil, a necessary, way that this business goes. Because at a certain point, if sometimes it's just time. It's just as simple as that. Sometimes it's just time for a certain player to leave a certain team, whether they're leaving in free agency, whether they're getting traded, whatever the situation might be. And I think we might be at that point with Chris Kreider. But again, I don't see any way possible that you can give Keandre Miller a new contract and also be able to afford Keandre Miller. I will say one other thing about the possibility of Kreider staying, and I've mentioned this in other episodes. Mike Sullivan being the new coach of the Rangers, I think that does increase Kreider's chances because he seems to be a fan of him. He really put over in his introductory presser the 4 Ranger players that he coached at the 4 Nations, and obviously Kreider was one of them. But again, I just can't imagine a world where you give Keandre Miller a new contract going into this next season for whatever that might be. And keep in mind, he is seeking a significant raise, and you sign Miller, and then you also keep Chris Kreider at $6.5 million. I mean, I don't even see how that would be possible. I guess in a literal sense, anything is possible. If you shuffle enough money around, you can find a way to make something like this work. But are you really going to bend over backwards to keep both these players on the roster? Honestly, I think it's more possible, or more likely rather, that both of these players are gone next season rather than both of them still being here. I think the most likely outcome is that one of them is here and one of them is not. That's more likely than certainly than both being here. If you really wanted to hang on to both of them, I mean, I don't know how. I guess you could trade Carson Suzy. That would move about $3.25 million or whatever he's at. It's somewhere in that ballpark. So that would open up a little bit of space. And you could maybe trade Mika or Panarin, but I'm not holding my breath there because both of them have no move clauses. And I wouldn't trade Panarin regardless because the Rangers are trying to win this season. But again, very, very difficult to imagine a scenario where that money works and you can hang on to both Kreider and Miller. Beyond that, as far as what the contract would be, if the Rangers kept Keandre Miller, I do think if the Rangers re-signed him, the Rangers could, should, and would look to do it on a short-term deal. Miller has 2 seasons left in the NHL before he becomes an unrestricted free agent for the first time. So I get the feeling if the Rangers wanted to keep him in the mix, you'd see them give him a 2-year extension. I don't think they're going to take him beyond his first year, what would be his first year of unrestricted free agency. I think they would rather keep him short-term and almost use him as like a stopgap option, which kind of sounds kind of strange saying that because he's your own homegrown draft pick. He's your own former first rounder. You wouldn't normally look at somebody like that as just kind of a placeholder, but that honestly might be how they see Keandre Miller if they were to bring him back, because they do have a couple of, high draft pick defensemen, guys that they seem to like, EJ Emery and Drew Fortescue. And maybe the hope is that by then, the two of them are in the NHL and they're holding it down. And at that point, maybe Miller, is somewhat expendable and you can let him walk, whatever the case might be. But yeah, I don't think if the Rangers re-sign him, you're going to see them break out like a 5 or 6 year contract. Never say never. They do love their long-term extensions. And no Ranger long-term extension is complete without some form of no move clause in there as well, or at least a partial no trade clause. I hope that doesn't happen if they do extend Miller. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, the most likely outcome here, if they do extend him, is that it will be short-term and will be 2 years. As far as the financials, his last contract, the one that just expired, was for 2 seasons, and it paid him $3.872 million per year. And again, I mentioned this very briefly in the last section, but I don't see how the Rangers can get this done without it being about $5 million per season. And for me, that feels a little bit rich for Keandre Miller based on how he played this past season. The other concern that I have about extending Miller, if it is for 2 years, which it probably would be, if it was for 2 years, then Miller's contract would overlap with next offseason. And next offseason, the NHL free agent class is absolutely wild. There's a lot of big time star players that will be UFAs next offseason. Now, I realize some of those players could potentially sign an extension with their current team before it ever comes to that. So I understand that. But nevertheless, you got to look up that list if you haven't seen it recently. It's pretty wild how many superstar players could be available next offseason. And I don't want to miss out on one of these big time superstar franchise changing players because, we're paying Keandre Miller too much money. And there will only be 1 year left on Miller's contract at that point anyway, if they were to give him a 2-year deal. So I wouldn't want the Rangers to be handcuffed because of that. Something else, though, that I will say I think works in Keandre Miller's favor, and this is something that we covered briefly a bunch of episodes back, probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago, whatever it might be. But, obviously talking free agents here on Locked On New York Rangers. Just the lack of other options for the Rangers if they don't bring back Miller, if they were to trade him away. Because even if they keep Keandre Miller, they could probably still use another lefty defenseman. And I'm not sure where they would go to get one. We've talked about in prior episodes some of the UFA defensemen that are available, specifically the lefties like Provorov and Gavrikov. I've made no bones about this. I don't think the Rangers should reach for either one of those players. I think both of them are good defensemen, but not elite defensemen. And I think both of them are destined to be underpaid due to the fact that this is a weaker free agent draft class. And teams that are desperate, they're going to really want to spend money to improve their defense, and they're going to have to meet the contract demands of guys like Provorov, guys like Gavrikov, and I don't want that to be the Rangers. We also talked about the possibility of a trade for Bo Byram. I like that option better than signing either of the two players that I just mentioned. I don't know how realistic that's going to be, though. There's no obvious solution next season. And if I'm Keandre Miller's agent and the Rangers don't want to beat his contract demands and, oh, we're going to trade you and we'll keep you, but only for such and such amount of money. My question to the Rangers, if I'm Miller's agent, would be, okay, you don't want to pay him. You want to trade him. Who lines up next to Adam Fox next season for you guys? And it's a good question. And it's a question that I don't think the Rangers really have an answer to. There's no obvious solution here. I mean, you could re-sign somebody like Zach Jones. He's an RFA himself, and he would cost significantly less than Keandre Miller. But we know how this goes with Zach Jones. The Rangers don't want to commit to him. I think he's gotten kind of a bad deal the last couple of years. I'm not saying he'd be a superstar, but there's times where he should be in the lineup, and he's just not in the lineup. And so I just don't see the Rangers bringing him back and putting him in any kind of a prominent role because they've never done it before. Zach Jones only gets to play when there are no other options. That's basically how the Rangers have operated when it comes to Zach Jones over the years. But again, I don't know. That might be the biggest thing that Keandre Miller has going for him because the Rangers, they have to re-sign him because there's nowhere else to go. There's nowhere else to put into his spot. There's no way to improve this team without, signing Keandre Miller, unless you sign one of the other UFAs who are probably going to be even more expensive. Or unless you trade for somebody, but then you have to give up assets, Miller by default might be their best option. And again, that might honestly be his strongest case for coming back to the Rangers. That might be the strongest case that the pro-Miller Ranger fans have for bringing him back. What else do you do? I'm almost talking myself into this. Bring back Keandre Miller on a 2-year deal because there's nothing else, there's nowhere else to go as far as, somebody that could fill out a spot in the top 4 and potentially be Adam Fox's defense partner, this upcoming season. But we'll see. In just a second, going to have a verdict here. Going to talk about how this is likely to play out with Keandre Miller, have some final thoughts, have a final decision as far as, what I think will happen here and what I think should happen here. We'll get to that in just a second. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers with some final thoughts on Keandre Miller and ultimately a verdict on Keandre Miller. And I've made this joke before, and some of you I'm sure have as well. It's not the most original joke ever, I'll admit that. But basically, this goes one of two ways for the New York Rangers. Either the Rangers re-sign Miller to a long-term deal at a significant price, maybe even a significant length. I still think it'll be a short-term deal, but it could be a longer one. You never know. And he never ends up living up to the contract. He just falls short of expectations, falls short of what a player should do when he's got that kind of a contract. So that's option one. Or option two is the Rangers trade him for a draft pick. The draft pick never pans out for the Rangers, whoever they take. It just never works out. Miller goes somewhere else, but then he somehow ends up on the roster of a division rival for the New York Rangers. And then he goes on to haunt the Rangers for about the next decade. That's basically being a Ranger fan. It's going to work out one of those two ways. Because the thing is, man, you can't sit here, even if you're not the biggest Miller fan, and act like he's never played good hockey for the Rangers, that he's never shown any promise, that he's never flashed some upside, that he's never had some big moments for the New York Rangers. He has. But my big problem is that everything I just said, flashing promise and upside and all that stuff, whatever buzzword you want to use, we saw more of that in his first couple of seasons in the league than we've seen in his more recent seasons in the league, and especially this past season. He's had some huge moments for this team. One that always comes to mind for me, to take a quick detour, a quick trip down memory lane here, is Game 7 against the Penguins. Now, you think about that game, and you immediately think of overtime. You immediately think of Artemi Panarin. You probably think about the borderline iconic call that Sam Rosen had. I think a lot of Ranger fans can recite that one word for word. And you think about the celebration and just the joy of moving on in the playoffs and knocking out the Penguins and making it to the conference final. But what you probably don't think about is that Keandre Miller basically set that whole thing up. There was a play in overtime, and it wasn't that deep into overtime because the game just didn't last that long. The Rangers scored relatively soon in the overtime period. But the Penguins had the puck. They're in the Ranger offensive zone. I forget which player on the Penguins, but somebody's basically trying to, tightrope walk the blue line because he didn't want to let the puck come out. But Miller challenged him, an aggressive play. He pokes the puck away from his opponent. It goes into the neutral zone, kind of along the benches there. And the Penguins had somebody closer to the puck than Miller, but Miller just absolutely exploded up the ice on this play, picked up the puck along the boards, worked his way into the offensive zone and veered to his right to the net and got to the net and forced the Penguins to take a penalty. I think it was hooking, might have been tripping. I think it was hooking, though, and that put the Rangers on the power play. And we all know what happened after that. Artemi Panarin with the game winner. That goal never happens without that play that Miller made. And it's entirely possible the Rangers might not even win that game if not for the play that K'Andre Miller made. Anything is possible, in overtime in Game 7. And I'm just glad that it never came to that. Huge play by Miller. We also saw last season, a really clutch goal against the Stars. The Rangers were down 1-0. They scored with less than a second left because K'Andre Miller scored the goal. So he's had some big moments. He's had some exciting moments. He's had some clutch moments for this team. But again, we didn't see really any of that this past season. We saw some red flags, some situations where, like I said earlier, he made a lot of mistakes in some big spots in the games. You can, somebody makes a mistake going full bore, going 100%. You can live with that, from time to time. But he made mistakes in crunch time and he made mental mistakes. And that's what you really don't want to see. There were just too many plays where it felt like he got caught a little bit flat-footed. And with that all said, again, I can see merits to extending him. I can see merits to trading him. The one thing that cannot happen that I really don't want to see happen is a 5 or 6 year deal for K'Andre Miller. If you want to bring him back on a 2-year deal, I can live with that, but I still favor trading him because I don't know that the Rangers can afford him, even in the short term. And I think you can get more for K'Andre Miller than a lot of us probably realize. I mentioned this briefly a couple of weeks ago in another Miller-centric episode. I want to elaborate on it here. I honestly believe you can get a first-round draft pick in exchange for K'Andre Miller. I think it's possible. And there's going to be some people that fight me on that, and I completely understand it. Because at first glance, I look at what K'Andre Miller did this past season, and I'm not giving up a first-round pick for that if I'm being completely honest. However, keep in mind, there's 31 teams in this league. All it really takes is one. I mean, I guess the Rangers probably won't want to trade him in division, so maybe that limits you a little bit. But there's a lot of teams in this league, right? And all it takes is one to offer a first rounder, and then you pull the trigger and you do it. But also consider the returns that teams were getting in terms of draft picks for players that they traded at this year's trade deadline. I'll run through a few of them here just to kind of compare it to K'Andre Miller. The Bruins sent Brandon Carlo to Toronto. They got a first rounder, a fourth rounder, and Fraser Minton in return. The Flyers sent Scott Laughton, a fourth rounder, and a sixth rounder to Toronto. They got a first rounder plus Nikita Gurbenkin, I believe is how you say it. The Oilers got Jake Wallman from the Sharks. The Sharks got a conditional first rounder plus Carl Berglund. The Panthers got Seth Jones, but that cost them a first rounder. The Jets got Brandon Tanev, but that cost them a second rounder. The Jets also got Luke Shen from Pittsburgh. It cost them a second rounder and a fourth rounder. Here's a good one too. Capitals got Anthony Beauvillier. Had to give up a second rounder to the Penguins to make that happen. The Devils got Brian Dumoulin from the Ducks. That cost them a second rounder. These are not, in most cases here, superstar elite players, and yet they're getting first and second rounders in exchange. Now, I realize it's a little bit different because that was at the trade deadline, and there's no free agents, right? You can't dip your toe into the free agent pool. You can't improve your team that way at that point in the season. And also, that's a time in the NHL calendar where, maybe teams are a little bit more desperate, so they'll be willing to give a little bit more than they would during the offseason. But still, I mean, at the very least, you are getting a second rounder for K'Andre Miller. Maybe not a first, but you can very clearly get a second rounder. And when you consider that you can get maybe a first rounder, but no less than a second rounder in exchange for K'Andre Miller in a trade, when you consider that, when you also consider the price tag for Miller, that it's probably going to be at least $5 million per season, could end up in arbitration. Who's to say for sure? You look at the fact that he's kind of regressed the last two seasons, especially this last year, very shaky season for Miller. And you look at the exciting free agent class for next offseason, I'm making the deal. I'm giving up Miller certainly for a first rounder, and I'm probably going to give him up for a second rounder too. It wouldn't be easy to necessarily replace him on the blue line, but that's where you have to get creative. You have to either commit to a Zach Jones. You have to hope that somebody like Drew Fortescue ends up on the Rangers a lot sooner than we all think that he's going to. You have to play some money puck in free agency, go out there and sign somebody for cheap that ends up, vastly exceeding expectations on what his contract is. Figure out a way. I mean, there's ways to do it. There's ways to make it happen. I would make this deal, and I'm very curious to hear what you guys would say. Let me know in the comment section. Do you prefer trading K'Andre Miller? Do you prefer extending him either in the short term or in the long term? But we've talked about this in the past. You can't keep everybody. And the Rangers have doled out a lot of long-term extensions recently. And at some point, it's just kind of a numbers game, and somebody becomes the odd man out, and that might end up being K'Andre Miller this offseason. We will see. But like I said, in my very humble opinion, the Rangers are better served trading K'Andre Miller this offseason than extending him. And as I mentioned earlier, I can live with a short extension if that's the road you want to go down, 2 years. You can't do the 5, 6, 7-year thing here for K'Andre Miller, at least in my, again, very humble opinion. But we'll call it there. By the way, I just want to throw this out at the end of today's episode here. If there's a topic that anybody wants me to discuss, anything you guys want me to get into in greater detail in a future episode, whether it's a draft prospect, a free agent that could be out there, any concept that you've got, any like historical thing you'd like me to talk about with the Rangers, feel free to let me know, because we've got a long off season here. I always say there's always something to talk about when it comes to the New York Rangers. You can always find something. But with that said, I'm obviously open to ideas. I did some quick calculations the other day. I went through the entire calendar, and we're looking at about 95 episodes between Ranger games, between the last game of the regular season and the first game of the preseason, when that's likely to fall, this upcoming season. So yeah, we're going to cover no shortage of topics, and feel free to throw out some ideas. I'd be happy to talk about any of those things that you guys would like me to talk about. But we can call it there. Once again, if you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @jchik17. Once again, that is @jchik17. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.